Now, you'll notice, unlike in the chapter videos, if you've taken a look at those, we haven't talked about first order consequence. So, and there's a reason for that. I think we're fine right now with what we have, not only because of where we're headed in terms of chapters 6 and 8, but also in terms of writing our exam. So what we're going to want to be able to do is stretch ourselves so that we can say, all right, from the standpoint of a truth table, here's how I can talk about this sentence. From the standpoint of a truth table, here's how I can talk about these two or more sentences. From the standpoint of a truth table, this is how I can talk about an inference. I can take those same concepts, individual statement assessment, multiple statement assessments, and I can talk about them in terms of Tarski's world. Remember that Tarski's world is a program built by our authors as a way for us to do and learn logic. It's a mini universe, if you will, and by mini, I mean, you already know this, it's a restricted universe. So that you can deal with, in Tarski's world, certain logical structures and logical relationships that are important and meaningful to the work we're doing, but that resist or don't fall within, if you will, the purview of a truth table. So just as a reminder, when we start talking about our connectives, our negation, our conjunction, our disjunction, we're talking about how connectives act on or operate on atomic sentences or already compounded sentences. And the truth table then is a test, if you will, of what a connective tells us about possible truth values. Think about it this way. And here's one way to think about the difference between truth table assessments and other types of assessment, which we're talking about in terms here of Tarski's world. If you have a blood test for cholesterol, right? I'll just pick on Connor because of the French fries. You got a blood test for cholesterol, right? You would think it's really weird if, rather than having your cholesterol tested by the blood test that tests cholesterol, your physician sends you to go get an x-ray, right? An x-ray is a different sort of device. The machinery looks at something else, right? It's something other than cholesterol. Or even if we just restrict ourselves to, blood work, right? A test for cholesterol is a different sort of test from a test for blood sugar levels, right? So, yes, we're talking about truths and falsities. We're talking about when sentences are always true or when sentences are equivalent to each other or when a sentence does or does not follow from another or others. But the way that we can test those questions is not monolithic. It's not singular. It's not one. Okay? So, a contingently true sentence in terms of what's possible in a truth table is, I think red will work, let's try it, is defined as follows. A sentence that is true on at least one row of the truth table, I'm abbreviating truth table as TT, where as relevant in the column under the main connective. So remember, a compound sentence may have a single connective, it may have multiple connectives, right? But so if you're asking whether or not the sentence is possibly true, right, you're looking at rows of the truth table, right? So each row presents a possible value, a possible universe, a scenario, or the conditions under which this sentence is true, right? So each row represents a possibility, but more specifically, it's the row and column that falls under the main connective if there are multiple connectives. If there's just one connective, then it's just looking at the row under the connective. Okay? So suppose we've got something like this, and I'll ask you to tell me if anything we're talking about feels unclear, right? So think about it this way. Presumably, you're not working on this stuff all day, every day. You got other things going on in your lives, right? So even if you're, and I hope you are, chugging at this a little bit every day, it may be the case because I'm asking you, the system is asking you to stretch your intellect, which PS is going to make your lives much better. I'll yap at you a little bit about that in a minute. You're being asked to stretch in ways that sometimes can make you feel at first like you're toggling T's and F's and you don't know how you're supposed to make sense of what you're looking at. Okay, so here's, let's take an example. So remember, we've got, if we have two atomic sentences, we have four possible combinations of truth values, right? Remember also that the sentences, truth values lay out the same. Doesn't matter what version of the system that you're dealing with. The standard, the convention is your first letter in the order is the first letter of the sentence for which you're constructing a truth table. And then the leftmost gets half true, half false, and then we keep having the first half of that first atomic sentence for the remainder. So let's try this guy. Suppose we have, it's not the case that both A and B, right? Multiple connectives mean that when we're done working the truth table, right, we're going to look at the column under the main connective, which is, which one? Yeah, which is the negation. So that means that we work our conjunction first. What's our shorthand, by the way, for the conjunction? The conjunction is true when and only when both of the conjuncts are true, or each conjunct is true, yes. Yep. So we've got the following. We've got true, false, false, false. The definition of negation is always the opposite value of the one that's being negated. So, yep, false, true, true, true. I'm going to highlight the column under the main connective. We've already used these values, so I can erase those. And since this sentence is true on at least one row of the truth table, we'd say that this sentence is contingently true, right? Does that make sense to say? It is truth table possible, which is to say, here are three worlds or three scenarios. Now, when I was first doing this stuff, and it still kind of lurks a little bit in the background of my thinking, I remember thinking, wait, you mean these four rows are it? There's no other way to talk about this sentence? From the standpoint of truth functionality, no, right? This exhausts every possible permutation and exhausts the ways in which the sentence comes out true or false. Sophia, what are you thinking? Take out all those... The red? Yeah. It's because just to highlight that once we determine the subconnective values, right? And then move on to the negation, we're done. As soon as the negation does its work, we're done with this. We don't need it anymore. We don't consult any subconnective values. We don't consult any atomic values when we're dealing with the assessments. Okay? So this is a truth table possible sentence. Now, this sentence is not a Tarski's world possible sentence. Why? Because we're talking about A and B, right? There's no way for us to build a world in which this sentence is true. Right? But we could do something else, right? How about this? And this will help us move forward to the next point. What if we say, oops, I meant to write something else. Okay, so for the moment, ignore the negation and the parentheses. What does the conjunction sentence say?
A is a cube and A is a dodec?
Yeah. The conjunction says A is both a cube and a dodec. Okay. From the standpoint of a truth table, right, what are we going to get in terms of values?
One true and three false?
Yeah. One true and three false. In other words, the truth table is not, to use the language of the textbook, is not sensitive to. The truth table doesn't, is not aware of, if you want to put it in sort of anthropomorphic terms, or at least more sentient terms, the truth table can't be aware of the fact that we know that these two shapes can't simultaneously be true for the same object, right? All that the truth table sees, as Connor's pointing out, is possible values such that the sentence could be true in at least one case, right? Here's what we understand. We'd say that from the standpoint of Tarski's world, this sentence is false. It's impossible. It's a logically contradictory sentence. It is not possible to build a world in which. That means then that not both is going to be what? Always true. So, and I'm sorry, I know there's a hand, but real quickly, we'll say then, this is a Tarski's world necessity. Right? It's a sentence that can never be false. Okay, so before I get back to the board to write some of our definitions, question, problem, confusion. There was somebody who had a hand up. Or was I imagining it? No, we're okay. Okay. So tell me about what it is that makes this sentence not just Tarski's world possible, but also necessarily true. Let's push on this concept of a necessarily true sentence. What do you think? So I'm going to define Tarski's world possible, and you're going to think about that question. Right? So if you can build a sentence in Tarski's world, or you can build a world, right, that reflects a sentence in Tarski's world, it's possible, right? Remember what Tarski's world is doing, it's giving us a way of thinking about what is possible and not possible, right? It's not possible to build a world in which capital letter A conjunction capital letter B is true because there's no object, capital letter A, capital letter B, right? Now, does that mean that the sentence A conjunction B is impossible? Well, narrowly from the standpoint of a Tarski's world, yes, but it's not impossible from the standpoint of a truth table. Right? We okay with that? All right. So if we can build a sentence in Tarski's world, that means that we can realize the sentence, right? That we can actualize the sentence, if you will. And then we've just seen that a Tarski's world necessity is a sentence that can never be false in Tarski's world, right? So the sentence A is a cube and a dodeck is necessarily false. It's self-contradictory, right, in Tarski's world. So rejecting that sentence makes it necessarily true. But if we worked a full truth table on this bad boy, we'd see, as I think Connor had already pointed out, and I'll put the possible truth values directly under the atomic sentences, we'd see that because the truth table does not notice, does not account for, does not incorporate into the machinery of the test what cube and dodeck mean. They're simply sentences that could be true, could be false, right? We've got these possibilities, and then like we did with not both A and B, we've got our various values that are then, negated. Right? So, remember what I was saying earlier about tests, right? What's the right sort of test for a sentence that is driven ultimately by the meanings of the terms? Well, it wouldn't be a test that the truth table provides. If, on the other hand, the sentence is properly speaking driven by the connectives, then yeah, the truth table is the right test. Right? So we say, okay, from the standpoint of truth functionality, here's what we say. From the standpoint of what we can or must build in Tarski's world, this is what we say. Right? It's like, you know, again, the physician saying, okay, based on what your symptoms are, I'm going to order this test, not some other test. Right? I can order some other test, but they're not going to give me the answers I want because they're looking for the wrong thing. I remember I told you a little bit earlier that I was going to make a sort of pitch for how the work we're doing is going to enhance your stretchiness, right? So no matter what your major is or what you're doing in your lives, being able to take these different standpoints is going to be enormously helpful to you in terms of your problem solving, creativity. Here's a story. I was reading about a woman who had experienced for a number of years tinnitus, right? That terrible ringing in your ears that never goes away. And so she's really plagued by the tinnitus. But then on top of that, she started hearing like clicking sounds, right? Kept hearing, and it just didn't go away. And it's like this slow torture where it was really kind of interfering with her life. It's debilitating and it's making her feel a little bit batty, right? She goes to ENT. She goes to just ear specialists. Everybody's telling her, don't see anything. Don't see what the problem is. Some people are telling this woman that sort of, well, she's just Lulu, right? That's the nice way or that's the not so nice way that they were putting it, right? And this woman is like, her life is falling apart because there's this just non-stop clicking, right? It's like having a cricket in your ear. Something, or like having castanets, right? Okay, nobody's helping her. She ends up finding a doctor in Boston. The doctor listens to her talk about her symptoms, looks at all the test results, and says, you know, I think there's a bone in your inner ear that's broken. And none of the tests have picked up on it because they're not the right sort of test for that. And in fact, and I don't know if I got this part right, but for the story, the point of the story, I'm going to just go make it up. None of the tests could pick up on it, right? But nobody was thinking creatively in the way that this ear doctor was thinking. So the ear doctor says, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go in, because I'm pretty darn confident we've got a bone that's broken. Well, the doctor was right. The woman had a broken bone, a teeny tiny little thing, right? You know, the ear bones are so tiny. But the doctor was wrong about which ear bone was broken, right? So the doctor was able to fix the broken bone, even though what she thought was the broken bone wasn't. It was a different one. And now the woman's hearing is, I don't know about the tinnitus, but the clicking is gone, right? And that's partly because this doctor, who you think, okay, here's a practitioner, right? This is not necessarily a medical researcher, although maybe she does research, I don't know. But she's a practitioner. She's seeing patients. And she's having to think really creatively and really stretchily about what her patient is telling her in order to come to a solution. Now, is she doing our work? In a sense, yes, at least as far as the skills that we're going to be honing in on go. I mean, we're doing the sort of work that's something like the intellectual equivalent of lifting weights or learning to play an instrument or getting ready to run a marathon, right? So it's not like you're going to go through life going, oh, here, I'm going to construct a truth table. No, that's not how things are going to go, but it's going to be machinery running in the background. Just like when you test some of those chapter 4 exercises in Fitch. Have you tried that, where you put a sentence, you put a conclusion at the end of some premises, you highlight the premises, you hit top con? That's a truth table humming in the background. You can look at that to see. Okay, so I've had some time to think about the question I asked. Kyle, what are you thinking?
Parameter.
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
So now, here's the short story. If we have a tautology, we will have a Tarski's world necessity, but not vice versa. Okay? All right, so let's talk about now the tautology, a sentence that is true on every row of the truth table, again with the caveat that we're talking about in the column under the main connective. Again, it's not necessarily the case that you will have multiple connectives, but when you do, right? Even if you set aside the multiple connectives, and let's say you just look at a single connective, you're looking at the values under the connective. You're not looking at the contributing elements. You're not looking at the atomic sentence elements. Because remember, it's the connective that acts on those elements. And the sentence is driven by that connective. So those are the values that matter. Okay? Here's a simple example in the sense that we have few rows, but I hope that you will be comfortable with this. So suppose we have the sentence A or not A. We know that that sentence is either true or false, right? We know that negating it means that it's either false or true. And we know that the disjunction is false when and only when. I think I heard Janet say, and I hear Connor say what? Yeah. Both sides or each conjunct is false. So that's not the case here. So we have a tautology. What are you thinking, Connor?
In a conjunction, both of the like parts of it are conjuncts, right?
Mhm.
So in a disjunction, are the parts disjuncts? Or okay.
Yes. And I know we're using the language of conjunction and disjunction to talk about the elements as well as the connective, right? So we just said a disjunction is false when both. So we're using the language of conjunction to talk about disjunction, but I hope that we can separate out the how we're talking about from what we're talking about. Sophia, what are you thinking?
How are we supposed to identify which are like tautologies and which are necessities on the test?
Great question. Okay, so let me just separate this out a little bit. My advice will be, and we'll look at the practice exam together, because remember the practice exam has the same number of exercise, type of exercise, blah, blah, blah. So what you'll want to do is create a truth table. You may look at the sentence and be able to eyeball, right? So for example, suppose you have the following sentence, A is small, medium, or large. You might eyeball that as a Tarski's world necessity, but not eyeball it as a tautology, so then you build a truth table. Or maybe you recognize that, oh, wait a second, yes, it's a Tarski's world necessity, but I can envision a scenario in which one of the ors is false, right? That is the main connective or is false, so the sentence is not a tautology. You might also want to build a world. I mean, it's kind of up to you to use the method that you deem the most meaty for you. One part of the exam does ask you to construct a truth table. So there, obviously, you'll do that work.
Also, it's possible for a truth table to have like everything true, right? Like VT possible, NTW possible, and tautology.
Yeah, great point. So all tautologies are also truth table possible, right? Because there is at least one row where the sentence is true. Good for you. How are we doing? So far, so good? Right? Matthew, what are you thinking?
So just to confirm, it can only be a tautology when under the conjunct every single thing is true?
When under the main...
Or the main connector?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So remember, you're not going to look at the constituents, the contributing members. You're looking only at the connective, right? And in this case, the main connective. So not both A and B?
Yeah, that example.
Correct. Not a tautology. Is TT possible?
Right.
Yeah. Right, and this makes sense this notion of TT possible makes sense, because we can say something like, I mean, we did this when we were first working the truth definitions. If I say Omar and Miguel wear caps, baseball caps, right? The conjunction is true because each person is wearing a cap, right? But there are other days when one or the other or both are not wearing baseball caps. So day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, right? So there's a scenario, a set of conditions under which it will be true, set of conditions under which it's false. If there are no conditions under which the sentence could be false, it's the tautology. Okay. How are we doing? Pretty good? Okay. Now, our last two assessment concepts are arguably extra crucial for the work that we're going to be doing in chapters 6 and 8. In other words, we're going to be using equivalences and valid argument forms to make our way through to the conclusion of a valid argument. In other words, we'll be using them to help us structure and a proof and derive a conclusion. So let's start with tautological equivalence. You guys, I think, remember this. Correct me if I'm wrong. So we've talked about De Morgan's equivalences, right? And this is one of them. So we're going to ask here, suppose we don't know that these two sentences are equivalent, we're going to ask whether or not the values in the column under the main connective for not both A and B are identical to the values in the column under the main connective for either not A or not B. Are we comfortable with which is the main connective? Okay. And how we determine that, right? If there's trouble with that, let's definitely talk, because that's part of the building block to get to where we are now. And I don't want you to feel like you're uncertain about that. Mohammed, what are you
So,
thinking?
The main connective is basically what relates the two, basically.
Yeah, the main connective is the connective that applies to all the elements. So this first negation applies only to A, the second negation applies only to B. On the other hand, in the not both sentence, this negation rejects the conjunction, so it applies to the whole. So we'll work the values as follows: false, false, true, true, false, true, false, true. And now we know that our disjunction is false when and only when each of the disjuncts is false. So we get
False. True.
yay. Now we look at the rows, right? So main connective or column under the main connective, right, for each, and then each row, and we see that they're true at the same time and false at the same time. So they're tautologically equivalent. What about a Tarski's world equivalence? Well, here's an equivalence that resists a truth table equivalence, but is equivalent, or are rather equivalent nonetheless. We could take something like this. We could say smaller A, B. Good one, Mia. Okay, let's try this one instead. Smaller A, B. This sort of double two-way arrow is tells us that we've got equivalence. Right? So we know that so this is a Tarski's world equivalence. We know that the truth table won't show us that, right? But we understand nevertheless that the two sentences say the same thing. So for tautological equivalence, we have two or more, although we typically only deal with two. So two sentences have identical truth values on every row of the truth table, again in the column under the main connective, where that's relevant. Tarski's world equivalent sentences are two or more sentences that are always true or always false at the same time. So we can say simultaneously true or simultaneously false. Is there any of my chicken scratch that's hard to read? What are you thinking, Sophia?
I don't understand like this concept.
The concept of equivalence?
Yeah. Like what are we comparing?
So when we're talking about two sentences being equivalent, we're loosely speaking saying, hey, these two sentences say the same thing, right? Now, in terms of Tarski's world, we know that smaller AB says the same thing as larger BA, right? Because we understand the meanings of the terms, right? So we would say that in terms of building worlds, we could never build a world in which smaller AB is true, larger BA false. We could never build a world in which smaller AB false, larger AB true, right? They are simultaneously true or simultaneously false always. In terms of a truth table, we're saying that the two sentences' truth values on every row of the truth table in the column under the main connective are identical. So equivalence just says, I mean, and we'll see this in terms of substitutions. You can substitute one sentence for the other because truth functionally they say the same thing. And notice again, that's irrespective of the meanings of the atomic sentences.
So that was the tautological equivalent, right?
Yeah, so these two are examples of tautological equivalence. These two are examples of Tarski's world equivalence. Tautological or truth table equivalence. Yeah. How are we doing? Again, you know, one of the things that I think is super, super fun, at least it's fun. I can say that the reason why I think it's fun is because, you know, historically I'm just so bad at this, right? I'm not that person that's like, yeah, duh, totally makes sense. I mean, that's not been me, right? My old college professor told me years later, yeah, I just didn't think you were going to make it, right? So, you know, why it's fun for me is because, you know, having to like just work so hard at it has meant for me that I really see the value in a way that maybe I wouldn't, I don't know. I can only tell you what my experience is, but I don't know that I would have seen quite the value in the nuances, right? In the subtleties of looking at what it is to talk about truth and falsity. And heck, I mean, you know, it's a part of our national discourse right now, right? People, you know, people are having trouble making sense of certain claims because, well, it's just obvious that it's true, or it's just obvious that it's false. But when you actually have to say, no, I can explain to you why this is a problematic claim that you're making. I can explain to you why it's true or why it's false, rather than just, well, duh, it's obvious, and if you don't get it, I hate you, and I'm not going to be your Facebook friend anymore, right? Whatever it might be, okay? So I hope it's the case that as we're working through this, you say, hey, okay, look, I'm not going to spend my life working on truth tables. I know that Tarski's world has limited use, but the I guess what some people would call the sort of the meta nature of our study is what we're taking with us wherever we go, right? We can apply it in a number of features of our lives. Okay, so I think it's super cool that we can say, hey, from this standpoint, this sentence is true. Or, hey, these two sentences are equivalent by way of a truth table, but they're not equivalent in these. You know, you can make more subtle, fine-grained distinctions. All right, our big ticket item for the course is the ways in which we demonstrate valid arguments, right? That's arguably like the biggest skill that we, the most significant skill, I should say, that we want to learn, okay? So here's what we can say. A sentence that is a tautological consequence of another or others is another way of saying that the reasoning is valid. Logical consequence, we've already seen, is another way of saying that an argument is valid, right? Tautological consequence is just a narrower concept. It's stricter, if you will, than logical consequence. But for all that, it's no less valid than the broader concept. So think about, let's start with the following, and I hope that, Sophia, this will reinforce your thinking about that great question about equivalence. Isn't it the case that since these two have identical truth values, that where you see one, you can substitute the other and vice versa? Okay. And some of you've told me this already, and I do the same thing. For each of the De Morgan's equivalences, this is just one set of equivalents, there's another. Some of you are habituated to think more in terms of the either not one or not the other than you are not both, right? Some of you are more habituated to think of neither more than both are not, even though they say the same thing on a truth table. So if you have two sentences that are truth functionally equivalent, or if you have two sentences that are Tarski's world equivalent, or semantically equivalent, say broadly speaking, then you can infer one from the other. You're saying the same thing, right? Now, here's a way in which we're actually much more subtle in terms of how we apply this rule than we might think we are. Argument. A is larger than B. B is larger than C. Therefore?
A is larger than C.
Okay. Mia loves Brett Michaels. Brett Michaels loves Joe Doggy. Okay, so, all right, so Miguel's shaking his head. No, Natalia's thinking, so Mia loves Joe. Now, it is true, I do love Joe Doggy. It's true. But what's the problem with the second argument that does not apply in the first?
It's not a rule. I can't think of the right word, but when you said less than, that's a relational connected.
Okay. Yeah, so we say that certain relations are transitive, right? So if A is larger than B and B is larger than C, that larger than relationship transfers over to AC. But love doesn't, right? You and I know that even though, so now, Natalia, if you want to stipulate that love is a transitive concept, you could do that, right? But you'd have to stipulate. You would have to say, look, for the purpose of what I'm trying to do, I'm going to define love in this way, so that, you know, if Mia loves Brett Michaels and Brett Michaels loves Joe Doggy, then of course it follows that. But if we go with our common understanding of love, right, or friendship or something like that, we would agree with Miguel that there's no way to transfer love from Mia to Joe. Is that how are we doing? Does that make some sense? Okay. So we do already get nuances. We do already get subtleties, right? We've got some more now formal ways of thinking about them. All right, so tautological consequence. We're going to look at, so here's now to sum up. Not both A and B is a tautological consequence of either not one or not the other. And either not A or not B is a tautological consequence of, wait, how did I do this? One is the consequence of the other. I couldn't remember where I started, right? So not both is a consequence of either not one or not the other. And not one or not the other is a consequence of not both. All right, pretty good. Okay, so let's now think about the definition here. So a sentence is, or sorry, I'm trying not to use the phrasing in the definition, so hold on just a second. Let me rephrase that. There is no row of the truth table on which the conclusion is false while the premises, or premises, right? It doesn't matter how many you have, are true, right? So if memory serves, we've worked this example. So let's take the following. So this will be premise 1. This will be premise 2. And then the conclusion will be the atomic sentence B. Okay, so I'm going to jot down another argument very close to the structure of this first one. Okay, so and it'll be the same order: premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. Okay, so here's a case where there's a single connective for each of the premises. So we don't have to worry about that in the column under the main connective. And what are we going to write, given our truth definitions?
True,
True, true,
false,
false,
and then false, false, true, true.
false, false, true, true. And then there's no connective operating on B. So is everybody comfortable with the idea that we take our atomic sentence values and just duplicate them, right?
True, false, true.
So true, false, true, false. Okay. Is there a row on which the conclusion is false?
Yeah.
Yes. Row 2 and 4. So look at row 2 and then cast your eyeballs across to your premises. Are the premises both true? No. How about row 4? Are the premises both true? Nope. So there is no row on which the premises are true while the conclusion is false. Take a look at row 3. If the premises are true, yep, the conclusion must be true. It is true. Okay. So B is a tautological consequence of premise 1 and premise 2 because it satisfies the definition. It satisfies the definition of a tautological consequence. More broadly, we would say it's a valid argument. Yeah. Now you might say, but Mia, look, you've got some falses here and a false over here and falses over here. I mean, you know, you think that the arguments, all the elements have to be true. Do you remember our little girl? Or little boy, doesn't matter, or non-binary, I don't care. You just got to be a tiny kid. I don't care. There's an individual, and you say to the individual, "Hey, little thing that's not, you know, not an adult, and so you can't say anything interesting, and you know, you got jam hands."
What's that?
Jam hands. I stole it from a TV show. Little kids always have jam hands, right? sticky fingers, probably from all the candy that they're getting. Okay, so hey, little kid, there's candy. It's in my left hand or my right hand. It's not in my left hand. So,
Be in the right.
yeah, and then when we open, it's just always, oh, if you ever want to feel good, if you're having a bad day, you just want to feel good, do this. Do this. Okay, so notice, right, row 4. Candy's in my left hand or my right hand? False. Candy's not in my left hand? True. Actual value? False. But if the premises are true, if I have candy in left or right, not in left, it must be in
Right.
right. So logic doesn't care about the facts on the ground, right? Logic cares about whether or not, if the premises are true, the conclusion is or is not true. That's what the care is, if you want to anthropomorphize logic in some sense. Okay? How are we doing? That also leads us to the general notion of logical consequence, right? It is impossible. Possible, right? I don't know which, look, this is just the version that obtained in the example I gave you. But I told you that one of my really good friends has kids. I would never do that to those little cuties. Not in a million years. Eddie is art. That's all I'm going to say. Right? So you know, I'll construct a sound argument for my friend's kids. Okay. Which is to say, I will actually have candy in one of the hands. All right. So to say that an argument is valid, to say that a sentence is a logical consequence of others or an other, is to say it is impossible for the conclusion to be false if the premise or premises are true. Right? So here's a non-truth functional argument that is not going to be a truth table consequence. And the conclusion is not a truth table consequence, but the argument is still valid. You know this one. We just talked about it. Right? A is larger than B. B is larger than C. So A is larger than C. Or great cheese comes from happy cows. Happy cows come from California. Therefore, great cheese comes from California. Right? What are you thinking, Matthew?
How come under that connective, there's 3 trues and 1 false? Under like a connective from like the previous example.
Oh, for the disjunction?
Yeah, sorry for the
Yeah.
disjunction.
So, because there is just the one connective, and the connective is the disjunction, we apply our definition for the disjunction. The disjunction is false in one case only. That's when each of the disjuncts is false.
And only when it's negated, it's the other way around?
Correct. Correct. Yeah, great question. Sophia, what are you thinking?
How did you get from this? Is it one large sentence or is it separate sentences?
Right, so separate. So I tried to somewhat duplicate Boole. So the vertical line separates out our sentences. The first 2 are premises. So I've got P, I don't know if you can see it, P subscript 1, P subscript 2, and then C for conclusion.
So why is B the conclusion? Like why?
Because I said so. Yeah, I mean, I wanted to show you a valid argument, and this is one of the hit parades. Also, given the at present limited number of connectives, even though we don't need more to say more interesting things, there are other hit parade arguments that will involve other connectives.
So like if this was on paper,
Uh-huh.
you could say like all of those separate
Right, right. And we can look at the, assuming that we get the projector going, we can look at the practice exam today so you can see how it plays out, no problem. While we're over here, I hope that this example will help us see what we're talking about when we're talking about non-consequence. So, Matthew, are you comfortable with the idea that we're just going to take it's the same sentence, right? We'll just take our values and duplicate them? There's no new calculating or determining to do. But here's the difference. We're affirming A, so we're going to take A's values and duplicate them. And then we're rejecting B, so we get false, true, false, true. Is there a row on which the conclusion is false? Well, the premises are true, and people go, yeah. Now, all of you who say, okay, I know it fails on row number 1, but you're so mean. Don't be such a hard ass. Well, no, yeah, actually, right? You know the song, Once Bitten, Twice Shy. You know Descartes' comment that if you've been deceived even once, it's better not to trust. No. Right, so think about it this way. If we want to say that an argument is, if you will, formulaic, right? It's never logically incorrect. Then there are no exceptions, right? You don't get a pass, right? Yeah, I murdered somebody, but I only did it once. No, you freaking murdered somebody. You're a murderer. Go do your time. Right? You don't get oh, well, okay, you had 4 chances to murder and you only murdered once out of the 4. No, once is enough to make you a murderer. Are we okay? So the argument fails. It's structurally incorrect. It's truth functionally unsatisfactory. Okay? That's all we need. It's just one row on which the truth table has the scenario of true premise or premises, false conclusion. Okay, what do we think? Isn't that awesome? Yeah, that's better. I love being able to say all sorts of things. Okay. Oh, actually, I don't think I need that. I don't think I need my drive. Let's see if this guy's working. Are you guys okay if I pull the screen down? Sophia, what are you thinking?
So for the example you just did where the conclusion was false, the premises are true, that would just be called not a tautological.
Right. So we would say that the conclusion or sentence 3, if we're in bool, is not a tautological consequence of the first 2. Yeah. Alrighty, so there it goes again. Oh, no, I guess it is working. Okay. Alright, so if we can I go ahead and pull the screen down? Alright. Don't let me forget that I know we've covered the basics of equivalence, but that at the end of chapter 4 we have some additional ways of talking about equivalence, right? We've got the 3 concepts of negation, normal form, conjunction, normal form, disjunction, normal form, and we will talk about those. But let's make sure that you're, oh, wait. Oh, no, I know what I'm doing. What are you talking about? Wait, do I have the caps lock on? No. sorry guys, hold on. Yeah, there are two different logins, and I obviously have trouble remembering what I'm supposed to use for what. Okay, so, just so you don't have all the junk here. Okay, so practice exams. So here's our practice exam. If you want to print out the practice exam and take it and not just look at the answer key that's provided, but have me look at it, I'm very happy to do that. So let me give you for example, there's one person in the 9:35 hour who says, you know, I think I might want to write the exam on Thursday, but can I take the practice exam and just email you, I'll take photos and I'll email you my results, make sure everything looks okay, and if it does, then I'll write on Thursday. You're very welcome to do that. So the first part involves some basic translating. We haven't done a ton with translations apart from the sort of nuts and bolts, right? So how to identify the main connective, how to use parentheses and so forth. When we move into chapter 7, we'll spend considerably more time working on translations. But here the idea is you're translating an argument, and then on the basis of that translation, and I don't know if you can see this clearly, but I've written out sentence 1, sentence 2, sentence 3, where standardly the last sentence is your conclusion. You'll then plug in your translation elements. So you've got 3 sentences. So you'll plug in premise 1 under sentence 1, premise 2 under sentence 2, conclusion under sentence 3. Then you've got your reference columns, and you churn out a truth table. And the idea of the second part of the exercise, the truth table part, is to determine consequence. Right? Then you've got a number of exercises that are devoted to the notions of possibility, tautology, and equivalence. And you'll notice that you are not going to be asked to construct a truth table that involves more than 4 lines. I'm going to take the, as evidence that you can construct a table with more than 4 lines, your work in Boole, right? So your homework exercises are sufficient. What I'm asking after here is not so much, do you know how to construct a truth table? I'm assuming you do, but are you comfortable with these assessment concepts, right? And don't forget, Boole gives you really good practice with A, whether or not you've correctly and completely constructed a truth table, but B, whether or not you've got the assessment concepts down. Okay. So that's the second part. I think there are 3 or 4 exercises total there. And then the last part has to do with the notion of distinguishing between what you can assess in terms of Tarski's world, what you can assess in terms of the truth table. Okay. So the scope of our exam is limited to these items. And I think, again, I mean, for me, the drilling is what works. You know, I'm one of those who very often has to just learn by practice over. I don't know what it is psychologically about kind of getting habituated to the stuff, but I become much more comfortable with thinking about it once I simply just know how things are. It's that Miyagi move, right? Just wax on and wax off. And eventually, when you're asked to perform the moves in competition. Now suddenly it makes sense why you're doing it, right? Then there are other times when just doing it, sort of the rote memorization doesn't work at all. I can't get at it by rote memorization. You know what works for you and what doesn't, right? So, for me, drilling this stuff is ultimately what makes it click. And that's it, right? So you've got, I think, 4 or 5, yeah, 5 of these guys. So going back to Sophia's earlier question, you may decide that you want to use the space provided or scratch paper, to build a world or to construct a truth table. Go for it. Sophia, what are you thinking? Let's take our shapes and sizes, right? We know there are 3 possible shapes, 3 possible sizes. So we know that if you're told that some object A, B, C, D, whatever, some object C is a tet, a cube, or a dodeck, it's got to be one of those, right? There's no way for it not to be one of those. That would be a Tarski's rule necessity. Same with size, small, medium, or large. Does that make some sense?
So something said like dodeck A, and then like cube A wouldn't be a 2W necessity.
Correct. Because it's possible, so it's a possible sentence that it's one or the other, right? It can't be both. That's a self-contradictory sentence. It's logically, or Tarski's world, false. But it's possible that it's the third shape. So it wouldn't be necessarily one of those 2. Over here, the negation of this necessarily false sentence makes this a Tarski's world necessity, right? Because it's impossible for it to be both. That means that it must be true that it's not both of those. What are we thinking? Pretty, yeah, keep going.
Can't you, for just the Tarski rule necessity, can't you just tell by looking at it?
Sure. But here's the thing. I forget how I was talking to somebody about this. I tend to make mistakes under a lot of circumstances, right? So I will oftentimes work through something just to confirm that my eyeballing was correct, right? So I don't always trust me to eyeball things correctly. Right, and I think that's also why, so think about, for example, in surgeries, right? There are these checklists where surgeons and their team go through checklists, and if they mark up the body so they don't amputate the wrong leg. I mean, when things like that happen, that, oh crap, you think, how could they make this mistake? It's obvious which leg has this enormous gash in it, or whatever it may be, right? But people do make mistakes. So rather than eyeballing it, going through the checklist is very helpful. Similarly with, flying a plane, right? I would prefer, because I have an irrational fear of flying, I prefer that, the pilots have this checklist and that they save their drinking for another time, right? So yeah, you can eyeball it, but you might go behind your eyeballing and just confirm it with the tests that we understand how to employ. What else are you thinking? Loads of fun. Let's go through some of the stuff that may still be troubling you in Chapter 4, and I'm thinking specifically of those later exercises where you're not just pushing a negation through, but you're pushing a conjunction through a series of disjunctions and vice versa.